King.
I know it's not really.
All right, everybody. Welcome back to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. We are picking up our conversation with just a little bit of committee discussion about what we've heard this morning on the municipal code of ethics proposal. So I wanted to open up the floor and see if we could lay out any big areas of concern or questions that we need to follow up on in future testimony. And also suggestions for people we need to hear from. I'll start with saying we do want to hear from the Secretary of State's office about some of their recommendations on both of these bills. So they're definitely paying attention and couldn't be here today, but we'll definitely be invited for our next round, probably next week. But other big items from this conversation that are on folks' minds, things we should be asking questions about, or people we need to hear from. It's all set, it's ready to go.
No.
We're done. Okay, let's vote right.
So it sounds like we've got a big question that we are going to need to grapple with sort of philosophically is, do we want to try to move more in the direction of having a model policy that each municipality adopts? Are we trying to create a uniform policy that is flexible enough that it encapsulates some of the, especially very small town kind of flexibility that would be needed? And, the recommendation from the State Ethics Commission is to adopt a uniform policy. The Vermont League of Cities and Towns, I think, is very clear that they want to maintain local control, especially on the enforcement side, which the State Ethics Commission isn't putting any enforcement hearings, investigation, just some of the stuff that gets us to that next level with the state code is not in the municipal proposal at all. So just wanted to make sure we're all grounded in that because we're talking about both of these bills at the same time. But yeah, thoughts. Representative Murwicki, did you have your hand up?
I did, and my guess is most select boards are as busy as the ones I represent. And asking them to do something else on might not be very much appreciated. If we could hand them something that would be easily adopted, it might be much better. It might be better accepted and help them move along. I think it's important for all of us, both in the State House and local governments, to be more transparent and have it clearly delineated what is ethical behavior and what are conflict of interest. And that said, that might make it easier if we could present something to them that was pretty close to fully baked. Well, we can do that on our own.
Yeah. You should have settled that for Representative Chase, go ahead.
I would lean toward, I think I'm hearing leaning towards a uniform policy. And that's where I'm leaning as well. I think it takes extra workload off from the local select boards from having to figure out the nuance of their situation. I also feel like, Vermonters moving from one town to the next, that would allow them to have a better understanding of expectations for, this is going to work just like it did in my last town, or at least very similar to for businesses doing contracts with towns. They would know what to expect if they were dealing with one town versus the next, and not have to spend quite as much time looking into what the nuance of a policy is for this specific municipality.
Thoughts?
I'm just gonna support what Representative Chase said. The continuity part's important. Like, I don't feel like fragmented policies, if we leave it totally up to the individual municipalities to develop on their own, the inconsistencies would be difficult to navigate for a range of entities.
So I think the work before us over the coming weeks and months, if we go down this path of adopting a uniform code and saying this is it for everybody is to work with the league and hear from select boards and municipalities about, you know, who should be covered. So that's a lot of what's in here is it's, you know, goes into all the different sub-legislative bodies and planning commissions and we should talk about, you know, what does it really look like in practice? So the complaint-driven kind of culture that we're trying to promote here. And if the State Ethics Commission is coming and saying, this is really going to be a service, I think it's our job to kind of sell this to municipalities and work with our partners. And I certainly, you know, don't want my city council or the select board of St. Albans or, you know, the municipal officials saying, oh my gosh, you guys are forcing this thing upon us that's going to, you know, wreak havoc and take up a bunch of time. The idea is that if we set a standard and everybody gets educated and understands that standard, that it makes everybody's life easier and it reduces liability. If we could really achieve that, I think I'm in favor of doing that work and trying to make that happen. I just would want to make sure that we're you know, having the bigger conversation and that towns know what we're talking about and what we're not talking about. And that we're hearing their feedback. So I'd like for this to be a collaborative project that we're engaged in as opposed to, you know, something we're trying to impose to solve some kind of, you know, problem. But I think we had a variety of perspectives this morning, and I've heard many over the years about how we have hundreds of municipalities in the state, and, you know, a couple hundred towns, villages, cities, right? And I think the vast majority of people who are doing the public service in those towns, to Mr. Brady's point, are trying to do the right thing and are behaving ethically, and there really aren't conflicts of interest that are run rampant everywhere all the time. But, you know, Representative Byron brought up a good example of when accusations of conflict of interest, absent a standard that everybody understands, can lead to loss of, you know, those public servants who are just like, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. It can lead to the public losing faith in our local governments and our state governments and institutions. And so I like the idea of everybody being on the same page about what we mean by conflict of interest and everybody kind of understanding that they have this resource that will give them unbiased advice about, you know, can they do X or should they do Y? But I think we've got some work to do to take these recommendations and make sure that we're adopting the right set of standards and that we're pacing ourselves in terms of how it goes into effect. And especially, you know, at this point, I just want to keep coming back to, for the municipal code, if we adopt a uniform code, the recommendation that we have before us is not to start with any kind of investigatory or enforcement power on the part of the state for municipalities. Representative Cooper and then Representative Waters Evans.
I agree with your premise, but I think we would be ignorant of current situation if we didn't recognize that there are individuals and factions that use those allegations as a foil for eliminating people and discouraging people from serving in public office. So two-sided to some degree, making an expeditious process that things get resolved is to the benefit, I think, of government.
Representative Waters Evans.
I just, in response to what Representative Hooper just said, I think our goal here is to have a muddy situation be, it's not going to be ever totally clear water, but make it a little less muddy, right? So that it would balance both people abusing or misusing the system, as well as give people like a clear avenue to know if their officials are behaving the right way or not. You know what I mean? I mean, there's always that potential with anything, but what I was going to say initially is, I think we keep hearing over and over again that the autonomy of the municipalities is important, and that the ability for the people who live in those towns and elect these officials are maintaining their kind of authority and control over their their towns and the boards and everybody in their towns, but at the same time, every town keeps having similar, not every town, but many towns, when a rare conflict does arise, it's frequently the same one or the same type. When Representative Higley was talking about, a couple in his town that were married, and the same thing has happened to Charlotte, not to any detriment at all. It's just a fact that, people are drawn to these career paths and public service and all of that stuff and end up, walking next to each other. So I think our work ahead of us is to balance and take into account the nuances of what it's like to live in a small Vermont town and have everybody intertwined in some way personally, while at the same time making sure that there's a standard that everybody is following, no matter if, your dad's the select board chair and you're building a 40 apartment housing development next door. You know what I mean? Those things are gonna come up, and just making sure that when they do, that everybody understands that there's a clear path while allowing people to do what they're gonna do. That's my hope for this.
Some reach, but not overreach.
I like to say not reach, but maybe just a nice cozy guideline.
Your thoughts or big questions we should be delving into, or recommendations for folks we need to get in here to testify as we work on the municipal code? Representative Nugent.
I agree with the approach, and I think that it seems like overall it would be really helpful for municipalities and the state to have a resource like this. And I also really like the idea of working with Vermont League of Cities and Towns and making sure that there's whatever policy gets adopted, it can anticipate how it would play out in all sorts of towns and cities. So I would love to hear more from maybe a few select board chairs or about that.
Yeah, to go off of that, the member who, Charlotte Select Board that spoke with us, they mentioned that Charlotte has just a broad paragraph for their policy. So I'm wondering if there's other municipalities that have a more robust policy that we could see if there's any consistency around other areas that we could draw into
So,
state.
Mr. Brady shared with us the model that VLCT has circulated that was in response to, back, I can't remember whether it was 18 or 19, when the conflict of interest requirement, to have a policy went into effect. VLCT developed and circulated a model policy. Many towns have adopted that. And that's just on conflict of interest. And obviously the municipal code has other components. That's one of the key ones. But that is on our website, the model. And, I quickly, while we were getting ready for Mr. Mudge's testimony, the select board representative from Charlotte, I looked to see if I could find if Charlotte had adopted it or not. And I couldn't quickly, they had it, the model policy posted on their page, but I don't know if that was for consideration or if they'd actually adopted it. So even then it's a little bit it will be interesting. His perception was we kind of have this loose paragraph as a person who's on the select board. And I'm not sure if somewhere along the way they had a resolution that said, yeah, we adopted the policy. And then we were like, okay, that's nice. That's up on the shelf. And we're just moving forward. So it's that thing of, even if towns and other municipalities have adopted the policy, I'm not really sure if we have a culture in Vermont of, and this is really what Mr. Mudge was talking about, right? At the beginning of the select board meeting, is the chair, if there's going to be something, are they reminding people about conflict of interest? I can think of times when I was on the city council where, there was one period we were doing a revolving loan fund, and I had to ask the city manager in open session, I'm friends with the business owner who we're going to give this low interest loan to. Do I need to recuse myself? And they're like, well, we're all neighbors here. This person isn't in your family. You don't have a financial interest with them. No, but because the vote was going to be unanimous, I decided to recuse myself anyway, just to avoid any issue. And it's that kind of is there a culture of that? And sometimes yes, and sometimes no. And some uniformity, I think everybody could feel good about. That's where I land, but how we get there and what the details of what's in this municipal code, and then what powers the State Ethics Commission has to work with municipalities, or those are all the questions I think we need to delve into some more and hear some more feedback, from league members, and want to hear the Secretary of State's office, and, our Secretary of State has a little bit of experience with some of these issues, given that she's my predecessor. Spent a bit of time on this committee. So, yeah, I think we've got more work to do, but other thoughts before we switch gears and talk a little bit about some of the stuff in the other bill. Right.
So if we did go with a model policy for towns to adopt individually, they would do that on town meeting day?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. So I would think, my impression of how this has rolled out is that the legislative body, so the select board, city council, et cetera, would adopt it. So that it wouldn't be that the whole town would adopt the conflict of interest policy, probably be the legislative body, the elected folks. In most cases, I think that's how it's worked. And am I wrong about that, Ted?
I think the statute requires a vote at town meeting because
Yeah.
it covers more than the select. But there is an exemption that allows, not exemption, a provision that allows other policies that meet or exceed, like personnel policies, to also satisfy the requirements. So you're both right.
Okay, thank you very much for clarifying that. So maybe we'll have legislative council talk to us a little bit about the existing conflict of interest requirement and what the limits of that are too, when we pick this up again. That's a flag for you, Mr. Devlin. I have to do that today. I'm not gonna put you on the spot with that. All right. So we got a few folks to invite and some big questions to consider around the municipal code. So I want to switch gears and pick up our conversation on the miscellaneous statewide language that we had before us, and invite Director Syvret back. And I think you shared with us on our legislative page, there's a document the committee might want to refer to that has what the 50 states require for disclosure requirements. So one of the things I thought we could focus on before lunch here was the pretty robust discussion we had in the initial walkthrough of the bill of disclosure requirements. And so I asked Director Syvret and with support from TJ to be able to talk to us about just kind of best practices, principles around disclosure, and what we're really trying to get at. I think there was some concern from the committee that I just want to name that I'm hearing loud and clear, and I've heard from people outside of the room about, whoa, you're asking us to disclose way more stuff than we have to do now. Why are we doing it? Why would you even think about doing that? What is the purpose? Does it have to be this detailed? And wanted to give Director Syvret and TJ the opportunity to talk to us about why does states require more stringent disclosure? How is it helpful and in the public interest? And then give us some things to chew on as we what level of disclosure, especially when it comes to things like individual stockholders. We talked about that a lot. So Director Syvret.
Sure. So I'll just start with kind of framing the question as to like why we have financial disclosure. So it's number one, so the public can identify the financial interests of the representatives, people who are working on, policies that are supposed to be benefiting them. But it's also, and I don't think we went over this last time, it's also to the benefit of the filer, because what is helping the filer do is identify their own conflicts of interest so they can be aware of them, because you don't want to be subject to a potential complaint in the future for something that you had never, thought about before. And so I just wanted to, frame it that way, that it isn't only to the public's benefit, but it's also to the filer's benefit. And full disclosure, so TJ very kindly reviewed all 50 states over the last few days to come up with what other states do. And he created a chart, which we sent around, which you should have as of this morning. So he's actually going to be, I think, the best person to speak on, the specific issues and what the common practices are in other states. That, that's the benefit TJ brings to the Ethics Commission and has for the last few years in terms of what are best practices. So if TJ is available and it's a good time, maybe he could just go over what his findings were in terms of what the other states are doing and where our proposal fits within, those best practices, what you would consider to be best practices and what other states are doing.
Sure. if you haven't had an opportunity to look at the chart, it's divided into several different categories. And those categories weren't from the top of my head. They're the same categories that the American Law Institute has recently, they haven't published it yet, but a Principles of the Law on Government Ethics. And in chapter 6 of that tome, they talk about financial disclosures and best practices. And they lay out 6 different areas that are best practices for disclosure. And they are broadly assets, liabilities, outside corporate positions, outside employment, gifts, and certain types of transactions. And then they have another category that they call other, which there may be other things that, depending on the jurisdiction, you want to have people disclose. Most states, when adopting these, and in fact, the ALI guide itself suggests that with respect to each category, there be monetary thresholds. And you'll see, if you've seen the chart, that most states have, for each of these categories, a monetary threshold under which no disclosure is warranted. By way of example, some states with respect to gifts will say anything that's under $250 in the aggregate from one source wouldn't need to be disclosed. And then there are other exemptions that make clear that you're talking gifts from outside sources. You're not talking gifts from your family, things at Christmas. But that's by way of example. In terms of assets, the most commonly required reporting does have to go with investment interests and real estate interests. With respect to liabilities, you're usually talking about any loans. Some states say any loans that are not at market value, meaning that you've got sort of a special deal from somebody with respect to your interest rate. But again, these have to do with sort of core things that everybody has. But with respect to disclosure, there's thresholds set. It does bear noting that the function of disclosure is different from almost all other aspects of the code. Really, in the ethics world, there's sort of 3 layers. There's things that you want to prohibit, things that you want to regulate, and then there are things that you want to disclose. With that third category, the function of it is less to enforce or regulate the code of ethics, and more for the public's sake, to give confidence to the public that government is being run the way that it should be. So it benefits the public to have confidence in their government, and they can review the forms through some level of transparency. Certain states do keep certain items confidential from the public. But the public just knowing that these forms are filed gives it confidence in the decision-making of its government. It's also a benefit to the filing official, because at least on an annual basis, some states do it more often, but at least on an annual basis, it allows the official to review things that are in their portfolio. And oftentimes, the official won't have it hasn't clicked yet that this might be a problem. But if it is on that annual review going to be a potential problem, it affords the official the opportunity to cure whatever conflict might arise in the future. Third, it's a benefit to the commission, because the commission can help people cure conflicts. But really, all of the involvement of people outside the officials is toward the goal of making sure that the form is accurate, not that the form is, somehow omitting information. And along those lines, most states have an opportunity to cure. if any omission or mistake is included in the form. So say that somebody flags to the commission, calls up and says, I know that this official owns real estate in such and such area, and that is on the agenda for them to consider in their position at the next meeting. Usually there would be an opportunity to cure that would allow the commission to call up the official and say, hey, you know, we noticed on your form that this isn't on there. If it's truly an asset, you should disclose it on the form. And that's the end of the inquiry. And that's the way that most states deal with this. They deal with it on sort of a separate tier than they would other types of ethics rules.
Questions about this? I think they're going to be alive. Representative Chase.
A quick question on the gifts. Is that over a 1-year period or like a rolling thing, calendar year? What's the industry standard, please?
The general rule of thumb is it's a certain amount in the aggregate from a single source. So if somebody gave you 5 $50 gifts, that would be 250 in the aggregate.
Over the course of 5 years or over the course of 1 year, or just over the lifetime?
Over the course of the filing period. And in Vermont's case,
Okay.
what we'd be looking at is an annual disclosure.
Okay, thank you.
So I think what I'm hearing you say, TJ, is that the ask on the form is public official, you know, that's us in the General Assembly, folks that are in the administration, et cetera, that any of those covered officials that need to do the disclosure, that they're reporting whatever these requirements are for the previous 12 months, but that and so that's the ask on the form. If they, you know, for instance, if we do ask them to disclose any individual stock holdings, for instance, that was a big discussion we had last time, a new ask on the form if we passed this. You know, if they wrote 8 of the stocks they have holdings in, but they omitted the 9th, and then someone complained and said, hey, you left this off. You've got $100,000 of holdings in X company. The idea would be that there would be a cure period typically where the person could change that without experiencing a penalty. Is that what I'm hearing you say is kind of the typical process?
That's the norm. Yeah, the goal is just to make sure that the forms are accurate and full. That's the overarching goal of the financial disclosure.
And if I'm looking at the chart and reading it correctly, there's a variety of different approaches, but it looks like many states have the requirement, or most states have the requirement to report investment income. So like a gain that was actually realized in the last 12 months. But then there's more variety when it comes to policies about disclosing individual holdings.
Most of the states go for the kind of simplest, easy to follow rules. And so with respect to income, the way it's phrased usually is identify every source of income that you received over a threshold amount, whether that's, you know, 2,000, 5,000. And included among that would be, if your source is the sale of stock, that would be the source that you disclosed.
Just to clarify, I think, and he's talking about that as income, not necessarily as an investment holding. That would be a separate category.
Yeah. With respect to investment, this is, as kind of a side note, this has been the subject for a lot of states over the last 10 years to try and sort this out. Most of the states enacted financial disclosure provisions in the aftermath of Watergate and having to do with their entire ethics program. Back in the mid-70s, not a lot of people held individual stocks. It's sort of a modern phenomenon that not only do people own stocks that are not in a retirement account, but they also own mutual funds or funds that follow a certain index. And so a lot of states have had to revisit their broad rules to try and accommodate this. The general rule of thumb that most states are coming around to is they'll focus on individual investments, not on mutual funds, not on retirement accounts. But if you have a certain threshold with regard to a specific stock, even if that specific stock is in a mutual fund, it would still qualify. But a specific stock over a certain threshold, you would have to disclose that.
Okay, I want to make sure that I understand that. So the idea here is that if you have a holding over a certain threshold in an individual stock, I guess I'm trying to get at the principle behind the advantage of disclosing it in the public interest, so that the public can understand what your potential conflict is. If you have $100,000 in a mutual fund versus $100,000 in a specific corporation, those are a little different, right? Like the individual policymaker doesn't have the ability to control what's in and out of the mutual fund. It's very unlikely that they'd have any real policy motivation to do something to try to influence the value or be able to influence the value of a mutual fund. It might be more so if they have a large holding in an individual stock and, you know, have a regulatory authority or a policy making authority over that particular industry. Is that the principle that we're trying to get at here?
We are, and the concern, at least the modern concern, is now the ability for individuals to establish their own bespoke mutual fund with certain holdings. And if you have a bespoke mutual fund that is 99% one stock and then 1% several other stocks, it would tee up the same disclosure as just holding that individual stock. Again, if it's over a certain threshold, and the threshold is up to you to decide what's appropriate for the state of Vermont.
So I guess the question would be, if we decided to come up with a Vermont appropriate disclosure policy, is there a distinction between things like, you know, if you have a managed fund, a mutual fund, or even something like a blind trust, where you as an individual public official may not actually know what the individual holdings or have some sort of control? Could we put something in to really clarify, if we were going to say, yeah, if you have an individual holding above a certain amount, you need to report that. If you have, you know, $1 million that's in a blind trust and you have no control over what's in and out of that trust, there's no need to, there's no way for you to report that. I've had several legislators ask me what those kinds of managed situations would.
They're going after self-directed.
Yeah, so we're really looking at self-directed here.
Yes. There are some states that will say, we don't expect you to disclose the holdings in your blind trust. We just want you to let people know, yeah, I have a blind trust. But that's not all states. Some states exclude that based on the same principle that you're introducing here, that you're not managing it yourself. You don't have the ability to control any of the holdings.
Representative Hango.
So there are two scenarios here. The individual who is responsible for making their own buying and selling trades, and the individual who pays someone to do it for them. So you're essentially going to penalize the person who doesn't want to pay the commission and does it on their own. And both of these situations, I can envision that stocks and holdings are traded maybe sometimes on a daily basis. That's a lot to keep track of. It's a lot to report. And again, it's penalizing the person who's trying to do it on their own without having to pay hefty commissions to a third party to manage it for them. So I'm definitely not in favor of that.
No, you raise a good point that there are states, well, every state has the issue of officials who have, for example, a spouse who is a day trader, and that's the profession of the spouse, holding large interests and selling them. So over the course of the year, you may have 100 of these positions that you've held over the course of the year. And this is, most states have tried to figure out ways to navigate this. Some of them address it by saying, any holding that you've had for over a particular amount of time. The other is that there is sort of a common practice among day traders that you have to keep track of things for tax purposes. And some states allow just the submission of whatever it is you're recording things for tax purposes with the amounts removed.
Yep. So just building on that, I mean, I'm not really talking about a professional day trader. I'm talking about people who dabble in this as a way of, first of all, some people really enjoy the stock market. They really get into the science behind it. And, and some people are just trying to supplement their income by making what they feel are serious and or profitable investments. And they put a lot of thought into it. So I'm not talking about like a professional day trader that's all they do for their job. Even though I'm not even sure what the tax ramifications of listing that as your primary source of income are, because I don't know anybody who does that. But I'm just talking about, the average person that really gets into this and really enjoys doing it. And I think it's overreach for sure.
So Representative Chase and then Representative Larson.
I hear what you're saying, Rep. Pango. I just want to push back a little bit. If somebody is trading over $10,000 on a regular basis, I'd argue that is definitely not dabbling.
You mean $10,000
In a
total
particular,
or one holding?
And
Okay.
one of the things that I've heard
Point well
repeatedly over this is, if you're holding more than 10,000 in one stock, that's what triggers this.
I think I heard your sorry, I know there's somebody else.
No, please.
I heard your concern was about, as being about inequitable treatment, for somebody who, goes through a brokerage versus does it themselves. I'm not sure that necessarily be the case, because what we're really looking at is, what is the individual holding? It doesn't really matter the method of purchase. So if you purchase an individual, stock through a brokerage, you're still gonna have to report it with, even same as if you bought it on your own. That wouldn't be something that would be different. The method of purchase doesn't really come into it. It's the amount of the holding. So if you own, $10,000 worth of Google, through a brokerage, or you buy it, directly yourself through, Charles Schwab, you're gonna have to report that, regardless.
So what's the distinction you were talking about with a fund that you don't manage, a mutual fund, for instance, that you don't manage yourself?
So in both of the instances that Executive Director Siebert was just talking about, they're individual holdings of a stock. So the $10,000 in Google that you own as an individual, you could sell it tomorrow. And whether you call up your broker or you go through an online portal where you do that yourself. And situations where you have an investment account where you may not even have any idea what the individual holdings are. So for
Because
instance,
they change daily.
well, not just because they
Sometimes.
change, but because you're not the one managing them, and the investments that you have, the individual holdings may not be known to you. So that's one distinction, was a question that was brought up to me outside of here by another legislator, outside of our committee, was like, how would you even know with a blind trust? You don't even know what your holdings are. So that's one question. And then the other distinction was, well, what if I have like I'm just invested in a mutual fund? What would I report? I don't know day to day what the different stocks are that are in that mutual fund. So if I read this correctly as it's written, it is a little bit ambiguous and we could flesh it out. But I think that what I hear from TJ and Executive Director Sivert is that we would want somebody, if they are invested in a mutual fund above a certain threshold, to just say, I'm invested in this mutual fund. And we're not saying that we're asking them to disclose everything that's in a mutual fund. That's not, that wouldn't be a reasonable expectation. But if you have, $100,000 in a particular mutual fund, I don't think that would be a big deal to ask somebody to disclose that that they have an investment.
I would look at the example of, so say you're invested in a Vanguard fund that's technology stocks. So it's a mix of technology stocks and you own $50,000 worth of that one specific, ETF. And you would say, I own this ETF. And then if you own $50,000 worth of Google individually, then you'd say, I own Google individually, but you wouldn't be looking at the technology index fund to calculate your ownership of Google.
So how do you come up with a conflict then? How do you determine if it's an ethical conflict if somebody owns, for instance, $50,000 of an ETF that's specifically, technology?
Yeah, I think that's a situation that is not really going to come up very often in real life unless, you're working at a national level and, you're like, you're in Congress, you're voting something specific to Google or specific to companies that are like all held in this one fund. So if you're in Vermont, what we'd be looking at is if you own an individual stock and it is somehow related to something you're voting on, then that would be something that would raise a conflict of interest. But generally speaking, if you're owning, mutual funds, it's not really something that's going to be, it's an intellectual example, but it's not going to necessarily be a real life example. You're just kind of looking at it in a situation of like, what are your financial interests? So when you are writing down your financial interests, not every interest that you write down is going to necessarily be relevant, but we don't have individualized financial disclosures for every single person. So what you're looking at is what is going to capture what is necessary for people to understand. So say we have the requirement that you disclose individual stocks. Google might not be relevant to your day-to-day life or what you're doing, in state government, but maybe Casella Waste Management is, right? And so those are the situations where people want to know what your financial interest is when it comes to, owning, a particular stock or having ownership in a company.
So why don't we just limit it to something like a Vermont owning stock or having partial ownership in a Vermont company that does business in the state of Vermont? Why do we care whether somebody owns $10,001 in Google? We don't. We shouldn't have to care about that. I mean, our constituents shouldn't have to care why we would own that.
Representative Chase, go ahead.
For a hot minute, there was a large international technology company that I won't name specifically that was going to help build out the fiber for the CUDs and so forth. But nobody knew that ahead of time. So having those disclosures in place ahead of time would have been an important step so that people could say, oh, okay, well, we're considering this plan of action. We have this information ahead of time. So take that into consideration as you're making your decisions, whether you need to recuse yourself on a particular vote or what have you.
When do we ever vote on which companies build out our broadband?
When we were getting into the nuance of the broadband CUD bill and so forth, there were some opportunities where it could have been swayed one way or the other. And having voters have that information ahead of time would have created greater transparency.
You would have to point to where in that statute that would have come up to me.
Yeah, because we're talking broadly throughout government. So say, the Attorney General's office is going to bring a lawsuit against, major national company, which is something that has happened. You'd want to know if people within the office or the Attorney General own stock in a competitor or in the prospective, the company involved in the prospective lawsuit.
You said the Attorney General would have to disclose his or her own stock holdings, but that's different from us legislators. Like why in that case would it matter what we held if the Attorney General is bringing a suit against, say, Philip Morris or a pharmaceutical company or something?
I think it comes back to not having individualized, disclosure forms. So you never know, you never know what particular situation is going to come up. So you're looking at a baseline of basic information that you want to know for everyone who's serving in office, rather than you trying to come up with specific forms for each and every person. So it's like the state code of ethics, right? We have the baseline of ethical behavior, and then you can have a higher standard. So what we're looking at here is the baseline of what we think that people should disclose, and then you also have your the legislature. So there's candidate forms, and the legislators have their own forms, right? They may ask for different information depending on what's important to know at the time of filing.
So before I go to Representative Waters Evans, in here last year, we developed a policy and had a lot of debate about sports betting. And if anybody on this committee had a significant financial interest in any of those companies, we could have, in statute, had a big influence over who was eligible to bid and not bid. And I think it would have been valuable for the public to have known if any of us had a financial interest in that. None of us could have probably known that bill and all of that work was going to come before us necessarily that session at that time. But it's the idea that everybody across state government that's a public official has the same level of transparency so that the public knows, like, are the people who are voting on this acting in my interest, or are they acting in the interests of every policy committee has the ability to advantage or disadvantage certain industry. And the idea behind disclosure is that you just have a blanket level of saying, if you're serving in public office, people know what your financial interests are. There may not be conflict at all, but.
Okay, so in that example, we had a competitive bidding process built into the statute. So how would that have mattered if, for instance, my domestic partner had stock in, I don't even know what the companies are called, DraftKings? How would that have made a difference in us voting for that bill or not voting for that bill?
So there's sort of two levels, and I let TJ or Director Sivert talk about the virtue of this. But on one level, it's about the appearance of a conflict versus the actual conflict. But I will say in this example directly, the number of companies that got to bid was a really key policy decision that we made, right? And we had a lot of influence over what the bidding process might look like when we wrote that bill. And even things like the level of advertising, and what the restrictions were around advertising. We put people in the chair from the industry to testify for us. And, I think especially like I have a lot of decision about who gets to testify as the chair, right? And so if I had a financial interest in one of those companies, I think it would have been in the public's interest to know that I might be biased towards one of those companies or another.
Probably you as a chair, I'll go with that. Right.
All of us
Me as a
voting,
member?
I think is important, but I don't want to give other people the opportunity. So Representative Waters Evans.
Thank you. I mean, this is kind of along the same lines. I'm wondering, so if I have, let's say, just because we've been talking about Google, if I have $12,000 worth of Google stock, I'm not going to be able to call the dudes who own Google or text them and get them to make a decision, right? So I'm wondering, I noticed on the chart that they provided that there are some states that have a percentage instead of an amount. I'm wondering if that would be something maybe that we could delve into a little further. I'm wondering if you two have any thoughts on it, maybe if a percentage might be something that we could talk about, because that might alleviate some of your concerns about, what level of influence will I really have if I have $10,001 of Amazon stock. Jeff Bezos is not going to listen to me personally. And I don't think a decision that Vermont makes in whatever our context is going to have a huge impact on like a bazillion-dollar company. You know what I mean? So that may be something to consider.
Isn't that what we do with company ownership? Now if you have over a certain percentage of ownership of a company, you need to disclose that.
Right. And even if it were a Vermont, it's more pertinent if it's a Vermont company, obviously, than if it's like a multinational.
So I'm open, very open. And
Yeah.
and like I said from the outset, I want to make sure we have consensus around what the right disclosure requirements
Right.
and info is. So I think this discussion is really helpful for me to kind of understand what are people's anxieties, what questions we need to put on the table. Obviously, we're not going to decide all this today.
Correct.
But broadly, I look at these recommendations coming in and start to think about, is it just that the ability for us to influence an outcome, have a big impact on a company? Or is it that the public has a right to know that we might be motivated in our decision-making around something?
Right.
To have our own stock or company do better? And you're absolutely right. As the holding value goes down, there's less perception that there might be any real conflict there in terms of our interests. And as as policymakers for big multinational companies, there aren't a lot of examples where we have a direct influence. I totally hear that from multiple people, but I think there are instances where we could have an impact. And the idea is just to be transparent, because we're public officials with a lot of privilege, about what our potential conflicts might be before we actually sit in the chair and have decisions before us. And so just having a uniform standard, everybody in public office and the government has one standard is what Director Sibert was getting at. And what that standard is up to all of us to figure out here. So I want to go to Representative Chase, then I'll come back to you.
Sure.
Just real quick, I'm pretty sure I heard what you were saying as being percentage of the company ownership as opposed to percentage of portfolio, right?
Correct.
Thank you.
That was what I meant.
I was gonna say, I would also look at this as being protected. So you're talking about a situation where a spouse may own a stock in DraftKings. If it's something that's not reported, I mean, because you don't have to, disclose it at this moment in time. So that's one thing. But if people find out about that stock ownership and then find out that you're voting on it and feel like something is being hidden and feeling like there's not transparency, that can be something that, it doesn't engender goodwill, right? And so when you're actually being transparent and disclosing your ownership and things, I think this does protect you in the sense that you're like, I'm not trying to hide this. And this gives you the opportunity as well to identify your own potential conflicts of interest and questions that may arise and how you're going to handle it. Whether you should handle it through filing a appearance of conflict of interest disclosure form, or, you're going to handle it some other way. But I think that I wouldn't look at this solely as something that's only to the public's benefit. I do think it is to the benefit of the filer too, not just in understanding what their potential conflicts are, but also just, in terms of transparency and, knowing what's out there and, putting forth that you are being a transparent, representative, and you're not trying to, hide something in your official actions when it comes to your official actions.
Representative Hankin.
Thank you. I just want to comment on that I feel like you just said that we can't be trusted to decide for ourselves what the degree of transparency needs to be and what our conflicts of interests are. I mean, I feel like I've been in public service for 30 years doing various things, and I think I know when I have a conflict of interest. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but I feel like that's a little bit disrespectful of us, and we know who our constituents are and what they expect out of us. So
I don't think that's, sorry to get that way. That's not what I meant. I'm just saying that in the sense that, if you do not have to, if you're not making that disclosure, and right now you're not required to, but if somebody, finds out that there's a financial interest in some other manner, then they could feel like something is being hidden. They could feel like something is going on that shouldn't be, or if it's out in the open, that lessens the risk of that happening. So maybe I didn't explain myself very clearly, which happened.
I appreciate that. I just think people don't really want some of their private business out in the open, frankly, because it may not be anybody's business but our own.
Representative.
It's okay, I'd just like to change my vote on sports betting. Appreciate the commercials that are all along.
Thanks for providing the levity, Representative. All right, let's bring it back.
I'm going to add one thing to my comment. Sorry. I just also want to say that I totally get this when you're a candidate for a public office in the federal government, or even if you're a statewide candidate and you don't know all your constituents, but little tiny corner of Vermont that we represent as representatives, I feel like this is just a lot more than we need to be required to do. And I feel like it's just one more deterrent for people. I mean, if you can't really control what other people in your household do. And if it's not illegal, you can't tell them to stop. So like, where does that leave the person running for office when you know that the person who's in your household might have holdings in above a certain amount of money in a company that who knows the state might want to contract with someday? I mean, that person in the household did not choose to run for office. So, I mean, if it just applied to me, maybe that's okay. But, and I'm speaking hypothetically here because I have had constituents asking me about this who have viewed these hearings and know what we're working on. Because I'm pretty transparent. I tell my constituents what we're working on. And I think this is really just a little bit of overreach.
So Representative Cooper and then Representative Byron. Representative Cooper, go ahead.
I tend to agree with Representative Hango in the chilling effect that someone who's going to run for office might feel when they get to the point of saying, really, all this? Some of the discussion that we've just been having about stop anything that gets reported on your income tax form then goes to the Secretary of State and posted on their website is sort of the backdoor way that all of the stuff we're talking about, non-specific disclosure, would get disclosed. And when Representative Hango talks about overreach, I remember when we read it through this the first time, I took up the issue that you have to report stuff for your foster kids. And, you know, most people say that foster kid, you know, nothing to do there. I had kids on my caseload that had a quarter interest in that, or their family had a quarter interest in a professional baseball team. You know, you never know what you're gonna come up against, so it's.
Can I just clarify your question, Representative Cooper? Is there any requirement, Director Siebert, about kids, foster kids? I thought we were only talking about in your recommendations, the public official and their sponsor or domestic partner having to disclose. Is that what you're getting at?
I'm looking here from where I saw it, but there was something that referenced.
Household members.
Yeah, household.
That's what I saw too.
Well, I think there's the form as it exists now. And so let me just scroll it.
In a nutshell, I think it's a chilling effect that it may have on people who want to run for office. And quite frankly, if my wife files individually and her tax return has to be submitted to the Secretary of State and she says, no, I'm not going to, that bars me from running for office, which I think has far-reaching complications.
So a couple of things that I want to pull out of that, Director Siebert. My understanding was the only folks who had to submit their tax returns were statewide candidates, not General Assembly, not.
That's my understanding. I mean, that all goes through Secretary of State's office, but
I
that's.
saw that we as state reps would have to. Did you think you saw?
Our
that
tax
as well?
returns? I
Yeah,
don't
tax
believe that's-
returns.
No, tax returns are not in this proposal.
Thank you for that clarification, because the way I read it, I felt that we were subject as well as our spouses to
Yeah.
tax disclosure.
No,
Yeah,
the tax, actually, that's not changing at all from
Okay.
current practice.
We should-
Statewide, yeah,
let's-
statewide officials right now, and please, Director Siebert, correct me if I'm wrong. Statewide candidates right now, so our constitutional officers, et cetera, they have to submit their 1040s. They can be redacted to a certain degree, but that's existing practice and that does not change in this proposal, right?
So I think that's ambiguous language that exists, because I remember the first year that I ran, I actually redacted and prepared my taxes for submission.
Well,
And the House campaign director was like, whoa, time out, you're doing what? So I read it that way the first year I read.
Where is this bill on our webpage? It's not under today's date.
It
is.
is, yeah, there's no bill number, it's still draft.
Yeah, this is the, so under Tim Devlin, this is the state ethics and draft.
Yeah.
Can I just get, Tim Devlin in on this, because I just want to make 100% sure we're all talking about the same thing when it comes to what's in the bill around tax returns.
Sure. For the record, to note the legislative council, the existing law, which is in Title 17 for elections and nominations under miscellaneous provisions, Section 2414, which is in this bill, candidates for state and legislative office, semicolon disclosure form. Section B has to do, C, states in addition to the reporting for all officers, each candidate per state office shall attach a disclosure form described in subsection A of this section copy with a copy of his or her most recent U.S. individual income tax return, Form 1040. And then there's some information after that, and that's why this is, so right now, you're correct, Chairman Berkey is for state office.
And so state office in that definition does not include members of the General Assembly, and it doesn't include like the deputy commissioners and the other folks in the administration that would be covered by some of these other disclosure requirements.
And confusing since we are sitting in the
It
state.
Yeah,
house.
so the state, you're in the, yeah,
Three
exactly.
of us thought that that's what it meant.
I mean, I
We
actually,
need
I
to get that
prepped the
changed.
document.
That's why we're not moving this bill fast.
Yes.
Also want everybody to know that, you know, some of us were on the committee that actually passed that law, and at the time, we delved into it and we felt pretty comfortable
And
about it.
before we hit lunch, I want to ask a different question.
Okay,
Sorry.
Representative Byron, and I'll go back to Representative Hango if that's okay.
Is this finishing up this portion?
Finishing
Okay,
up,
great,
yes.
let's do that, then. Let's do that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Tim, section 1, subsection 2414, candidates for state and legislative office disclosure form. I think we were down at the bottom of that, but when you go up to the very top, it references each candidate for state office, county office, state senator, or state representative. Or did I go back too far? Am I up too far on that?
You're correct, that is the correct statutory citation. 17 VSA 2414. It's kind of in each subsection kind of adds an additional layer of disclosure depending on who you are. So subsection A, you're correct, and will be modified to require state officers, county officers, state senator, and state representatives to file that base. And then subsection C further down, which is being modified, but not exactly for what is being required of people to be disclosed. It actually gets specific actions to that modification. That adds an additional level of disclosure, which is the tax forms, which pertains only to state officers, which are those executive statewide officers.
So I think what would be really helpful is if maybe we could get a little summary of what things are required under the proposal for the different office holders. That's just a little summary document. Would that be pretty easy for you to prepare, Tim? And current law compared to if we adopted this proposal? I think that would be super helpful for the committee to help clarify, because I'm realizing there are probably several misunderstandings because of the references and those layers. So thank you for clarifying that one. Representative Byron, go ahead.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, different focus, same conversation. Now, what about asset acquisitions of sales of non-securities that people commonly invest in? Car collections, artwork, gun collections, things that you can buy, sell with just as much profitability as a tradable security.
So are you buying and selling them as part of your income? And you would disclose your, so if you're buying and selling as part of like, self-employment income, then you'd be reporting it under that. That's what I would say.
Antique coffee bags.
I'm just saying, like, I mean, there's a lot of ability within artwork in there. I mean, but it's like, I didn't see it like reference to in any way, shape or form. Those are very common ways for especially artwork, people of wealth to navigate certain aspects of wealth management.
I don't envision artwork. I would envision that coming in under employment income, like a self-employment income, a source of income. I wouldn't envision that as coming under something that you're listing as an individual asset. TJ, do you want to disagree or agree with me?
There are a number of states that require disclosure of transactions if over a certain amount. And so there's, in addition to being income, you would have to disclose the details of the transaction itself. This bill in front of you doesn't do that. This bill in front of you is sort of a mid-packer among the states as to what it requires for disclosure. But if the committee thought that disclosure of transactions over a certain threshold was something that should be disclosed in Vermont, that absolutely could be added. But right now, it would only fall under if it was a profitable transaction and the income was over a particular over a particular amount, you would have to disclose it as income.
So it's the idea there that, I mean, I can imagine if someone, for instance, sold something to another party that was of a very high value, that would be reported as income. So it's like if you're a public official and there are big financial transactions happening, there's, you know, the potential that somebody is buying your house at an overinflated value in order to influence your decision or something like that. And so is it really about, you know, if you're reporting your income, if you're reporting capital gains, the public has an opportunity to see, you know, where your money is coming from.
So if I don't know that, so the reason I started thinking about this was the point that was made, the provision in here that speaks to the favorable loan rates. Right. And how is the purchase and sale of a perceived inflated asset different than a favorable loan rate?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're getting into other aspects of ethics law there. I think you're looking at bribery. I think you're looking at gifts and conflicts of interest. So you're not going to be solely looking at this through the lens of financial disclosure. I would say the way that this is constructed now, you'd be envisioned as reporting it as income, and then the source of income you'd have to identify. So, you know, there's a lot of leeway in the form now as to how you're going to identify your income. I mean, just as it is, you know, now with the sources of income, you can just say, you know, federal benefit, you don't have to say exactly what it is, right? Because we allow people to characterize it as they want. But the way that you would be identifying the source of income is, you know, I made over $10,000, so therefore I'm like sale of XYZ, sale of, you know, antique, sale of, you know, artwork, or however you choose to do it. And ideally, you're also, you know, identifying in some way that, you know, through private sale, through, you know, depends on where you go with this form, how far you want to get into how detailed people are in their disclosures. But you're letting people know it happened. And so at least you're laying the trail in case something untoward.
So we're basically at time. We will take a look at some of these questions. I have a number of things I want to talk with legislative counsel about. I'm sure other folks have questions. If you have recommendations for people who might want to weigh in on some of this, or things you want to put on the table, please talk to legislative counsel, and please talk to me about scheduling folks for future ethics agenda. So we'll probably pick up this conversation next week. Really appreciate the robust discussion, and Director Sivert and TJ for giving us their view and expertise on this. It's been a really informative discussion today.